Hello, YouTubers, friends, compatriots, bootlicker shills, debt slaves, sirs, peasants, vassals, minions, meat sacks. I'm useful today. Welcome. And let's go to the Vatican and this unusual interview that came out with Pope Francis. And I see it's hitting the major headlines now. And depending on the headlines you get, it's more sensationalist sometimes than others. But once you get into the meat of the story, it's pretty undeniable that Pope Francis is making comparisons between Trump and Hitler. And I know, particularly in this climate, a lot of people are embracing these fascist claims and these Hitler claims and comparing him to Trump. But I find it fascinating and a little disturbing because, for one thing, the history of using Hitler comparisons goes far back in American politics, back to the time when Hitler was actually alive in the world. And so it has a lot of historical context. And then the fact that it's passed back and forth. The conservatives, of course, make Hitler comparisons with Obama. And in fact, I was deeply offended one time because a bunch of LaRouche people were out in front of a post office I went to, and I got in a discussion with them, said that, when you put posters up of Obama with a Hitler mustache and make these Hitler comparisons, you're really not going to get anybody to listen to you. And it's just offensive. And so anyway, it's a bipartisan thing. And also the history of the U.S. government using these Hitler connections whenever they want to demonize somebody. They use Hitler connections with Gaddafi. They use Hitler connections with Saddam Hussein. They use Hitler connections with Noriega. And in fact, it was a great story when Reagan invented, or let's see, was it Reagan or Bush Sr.? I can't remember, who invaded Panama. It was a great story about how they planted pictures of Hitler on Noriega's desk so they could continue to demonize him and use that connection. So it's a great political tool. I do a lot of videos on things that are used as political tools, and this whole Hitler comparison, fascism comparison is just another political tool and doesn't really have much basis in reality. Another thing I find really offensive about it is because I'm actually fairly well versed in German history. I have two degrees from the University of Washington, both in German culture and German art and German music and German history. And so I'm very, very well versed in the whole concept of the rise of Nazism in Germany. And these comparisons are just really off base. So I feel like I have some legitimacy discussing it. But let's get into the meat of this story. So on January 21st, Pope Francis came out. Oh, let me say one other thing. I find this disturbing also because I think as a religious leader, it's pretty awkward and probably not legitimate for a religious leader to get involved in politics. And this particular pope has been an activist pope, one might say, and that seems to come with the territory now. And so anyway, I think that's kind of inappropriate as well. And certainly if Pope Francis has ever came out in the last years and talked about all the bombings and stuff all over the Middle East by Obama, condemn that, then that would also be fairly disingenuous. But that didn't happen. But anyway, let's get to the meat of this. Like I said, January 21st, Pope Francis came out. He did an interview in a Spanish newspaper, El País, and the Pope warned against populism and saviors like Hitler. And one problem I have with that phrase, of course, is the fact that this idea that populism is somehow some sort of evil, that rebellion is now being delegitimized by all these global leaders, politicians mostly, but weird to have the Pope come out and rail against populism. You'd think religions would be all for populism. I don't know how populism became a dirty word. And I know the connotations between populism and the uninformed masses, but these days populism shouldn't be a threat because it's not only the lower classes that have been traditionally uninformed, but now we have the middle and upper classes that are equally as uninformed. So yeah, there's some dangers to populism, but the idea that somehow it's rooted in the bottom with the deplorables, etc., once again is misleading. So the Pope went on to condemn using walls and barriers to keep out foreigners, which is somewhat legitimate, although to pick out Trump and his projections of doing that once again, is a little disingenuous because we have countries all over the world that he has not condemned and leaders all over the world that have not been condemned for doing just that. And all over the world. And I didn't, I'm not citing examples of that because I got a lot more to get into in this video, and I can't get bogged down in that. So Pope Francis said that, quote, Germany was looking for a leader, someone who would give her back her identity, and there was a little man named Hitler who said, I can do it, unquote. So that's a pretty blatant example of trying to compare Trump to Hitler. He went on to say that, quote, Hitler did not steal power. He was elected by his people, and then he destroyed his people, unquote. And once again, pretty clear that it's a Hitler comparison. And so let's go on a little bit further. The quote, the Germans also wanted to protect themselves with walls and barbed wire so that others cannot take away their identity, unquote. And quote, the case of Germany is classic. Hitler gave them a deformed identity, and we know what that produced, unquote. And so once again, these comparisons, but I would note that nobody seems to condemn Japan for having fairly strict immigration laws and maintaining their national identity, but not by not having that many foreigners there. And there's a lot of countries that are examples of that. And so I just wanted to point that out. I don't want to get into that too much. But then ultimately, the headline that's going around and what is the bottom line for Pope Francis is, quote, let's see what he does, and then we will evaluate, unquote. And so that's interesting in comparison to the same Pope, Pope Francis, talking about Pope Pius XII, the one they call Hitler's Pope. And in 2014, Pope Francis authorized the opening of files about Pope Pius. And I found it interesting that the fact that we have all this documentation of Pope Pius and his collaboration with the Nazis, and I'll go into that a little bit more. And then his attitude towards Trump. And I know there's a lot of people that are concerned about Trump, but the fact is he hasn't really done anything yet. So maybe this will come true, and I'll later on in the next year or so, maybe I'll be doing a video talking about the relationship between the Trump administration and Nazi Germany. Who knows? But listen to Pope Francis. He's more than willing to evaluate history and make these judgments and not defend Trump and actually accuse him of being Hitler. But then when he's talking about Pope Pius XII and Hitler's Pope, he told the paper, quote, one thing that's worrisome, the image of Pope Pius XII. He has been accused of all sorts of things, including having been aware of the extermination of the Jews and doing nothing. I'm not saying he didn't make mistakes. He made a few. I get things wrong all the time. So I don't know. Once again, it's not so much I'm sticking up for Trump as so many people seem to think. I just want all the misinformation and distortions and propaganda out there from both sides to be sorted through. Pope Francis goes on to say, quote, when you interpret history, you need to do so from the way of thinking of the time in question. It doesn't work. I'll never get to the truth like that, unquote. And then he goes on to say, quote, I don't want to sound petty, but it really gets my goat when I see everyone is against the church, all these detractors, unquote. And then he goes on to make excuses for Pope Pius, quote, and what about the Allies during the war? They knew too, unquote. So once again, it points out that he's happy to interpret history, even the future, when talking about Trump. But when talking about Pope Pius, he says that he'd have a hard time interpreting history, and he'll never get to the truth by trying to interpret the way of thinking historically. And so anyway, pretty interesting. And scholars have agreed that the Vatican was fully informed about the Holocaust in 1942, and there was a lot of collaboration with the Nazis. And in fact, there's a Vanity Fair article that came out right after the fact that Pope Francis opened these files on Pope Pius XII, and they were shocked. Catholics were banned from the Nazi Party until 1933, but once Hitler came to power, of course, they are interested in power too, and they cozied up to the Nazis. And this is in a country that's mostly Protestant, but Catholic hierarchy was much stronger than the Protestant hierarchy in Germany at the time. So Catholics had a lot of power. And Hitler even came out and said that, quote, Christianity was the foundation of his national morality, unquote. And so the Vanity Fair article revealed the shocking details once these files were released. And so Pope Pius is making excuses for this Nazi Pope. And he apparently was a virulent anti-Semitic and blamed the Jews for their own problems. And I'll attach the article below so you can read it for yourself and see all this anti-Semitism in his own words. And Pope Pius also crushed the Catholic opposition to Nazism in Germany, and he denied and trivialized the Holocaust, even though he knew all the details of it by 1942. And he also didn't condemn the invasion of Poland, Yugoslavia, and Croatia, and all the files show that he was just another power-hungry elitist, and that's what we expect from global leaders, and certainly the Vatican is not really an exception to that. In fact, a good example of Pope Pius's racism is he campaigned against having black French troops in a lot of the border regions, and he also requested that no U.S. colored troops were stationed in Rome when it was occupied. So this isn't a conspiracy theory I'm making up about Pope Pius. Everything's very documented, and the Catholic Church had a long history of. Let's remember also the Catholic Church, including this Pope, has a lot to do with protecting a long line of pedophiles in the Catholic Church, and so are not a very reliable source for coming out and making Hitler comparisons. And let's go into the history a little bit. Of course, we have, like I say, the history of both parties using these Hitler comparisons. In fact, if you go all the way back to Benjamin Franklin, his attitude was that Germans were stupid and swarthy. And President Millard Fillmore came out and said that keeping un-American Catholics out of the country was one of his main goals. And then FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, had Japanese internment camps. And President Lincoln, of course, in a lot of his personal letters, professed that he, quote, had no love for colored people, unquote, and stated that a lot of his aims were political. And he may have changed his mind later, but that said, there's a history of racism and political candidates all the way up to Hillary Clinton. Hillary Clinton's racism is heavily documented. She's very anti-Semitic and is routinely, according to close confidants and Secret Service agents and people that have documented, referred to people as Jew bastards on numerous occasions. So anyway, the racism is rampant, and I'll say that racism is rampant certainly in the elites. They're no different. In spite of all this professed love for the masses, they have no love for the masses. And the political use of it, of course, goes back to people like George McGovern has used Hitler comparisons, Hubert Humphrey used Hitler comparisons, Martin Luther King used Hitler comparisons, the AFL-CIO used Hitler comparisons, FDR used Hitler comparisons against Wendell Willkie, Charlie Rangel and John Glenn and Robert Byrd have all used Hitler comparisons about George Bush Jr., and which is ironic. Of course, Robert Byrd, who is a mentor for Hillary Clinton, was a member of the KKK, a very proud member of the KKK. And once again, he turned his back on the racism of his early days, but has those roots. And who could forget Strom Thurmond, another virulent racist who was in Congress for a long time, and in fact, the irony that it was revealed later, the father to black baby. But this is nothing new at all, like I say. So it gets tired getting this all coming out of the system. And then during the campaign, ironically, this last election campaign, people forget that the GOP super PACs, the status quo GOP super PACs, were constantly making Hitler comparisons to Trump themselves. And I think the liberal base forgets a lot of times that the entire GOP status quo system didn't want Trump either, and they fought against him. And so that's something to bear in mind. And then also the connection too that has to be noted about Soros, who was a Nazi collaborator, and now he's bankrolling a lot of the insurrection. I shouldn't say insurrection, rebellion against Trump right now. And in fact, he's bankrolled a lot of the protest marches that are going on now, just the same way he bankrolled a lot of the Occupy movement and everything. But I don't want to pick on the liberal base, because of course the conservative base also has their giant fundraising and people who bankroll all these protests, the Koch brothers, et cetera, financing and corporatizing the Tea Party movement, et cetera. And so anyway, the Hitler comparisons continue to go on, and it's just kind of funny because Bush and Clinton and Obama are all very much war presidents, and so anyone could maybe make Hitler comparisons I want, but it just sounds stupid. And I'll put a lot of links below that go into this whole concept and some of the problems with making these Hitler comparisons. And like I say, let's remember the conservatives for 8 years of Obama use Hitler comparisons all the time, and Stalin comparisons, and called him a communist and everything else, which is ridiculous. He's about as far from a communist as anyone can be, and this idea that he's some kind of commie socialist, it's ridiculous. He's another corporatist, just like all the rest of the presidents. And so anyway, there's that. And then I wanted to add one last thought about this, and it's the whole idea that, first of all, that all these Hitler comparisons that are brought up, the masses are trained by the media and the politicians. They're the ones that bring this shit up. They're the ones that throw this Hitler stuff around, like Glenn Beck and whatnot. And then the conservative base and the liberal base picks up on it and just regurgitates all this garbage. And the other thing is, making these comparisons between Hitler and fascism and Nazism and the American system, it just undermines any rational discussion. And that's the bottom line. That's the real bottom line. We can't have a rational discussion, and just this inflammatory, divisive discussions. And Hitler is bringing up Hitler is one of the main things you can do, and the quickest way to demonize somebody and shut down discussion. But anyway, I want to get into that because I just think it's outrageous for the Pope to go along with this kind of idea, and he should have said, let's just wait and see, and left it at that, because we'll see. Who knows? Trump may end up being the next Hitler. I don't know. But there's nothing I've seen so far that shows that. He's caustic, and he's boorish, and he's unmannered and tactless and all sorts of things. But frankly, at least for now, I prefer somebody who's an asshole right to my face, and not somebody that slithers around and acts all polite like most of our politicians do all the time while they turn into shitbags behind closed doors. I'm a useful idiot. Don't you be one too.